On page 15, Sage further notes that this mother, father, son, and daughter tetrad remained an extremely important concept for the Jewish Kabbalists, where the pattern of hierogamy surfaced once again in the spiritualized union of the Sephirot in medieval Kabbalism, where we still dimly perceive the male and female gods of antiquity. Anathema as they were to the pious Kabbalists. This is particularly significant, however, because it is the nuptials of the youngest pair that were used as the subject for the sacred marriage in the Near East. Possibly because the mother and father tended to be otios, and because it was the son who was generally responsible for organizing chaos and providing fertility at the time of creation. Their pattern of hierogamy also reappeared in the allegorical marriage of Yahweh and Israel, and that's important to understand. So this is the basic pattern, this marriage pattern, that came all the way through up into medieval Kabbalism. This is one of the reasons why I find the Kabbalah so fascinating to study as well. He says the connection between the Shekinah, which is Lady Wisdom in the Kabbalah, and the connubial symbolism of the cherubim also appeared in the Zohar, the great 13th century classic of Kabbalism. Modern research has shown this to be a treasure house of mystical lore inherited from the period of the Second Temple. There is recalled there that before the Shekinah was espoused, in other words, united sexually, no one could speak to God face to face, but those who would gaze upon her should be married themselves, for God's righteousness and equity consists of the fact that he is both male and female, as were the cherubim. Sage further notes that the cherubim were symbols of God's redemptive marriage to Israel. This is why they were symbolically embraced in a sexual union, is because it represented God marrying Israel. The consummation of this covenant marriage would later take place in the Holy of Holies, in the temple. This is where the cherubim were displayed in their connubial embrace. It says on page 18, the right to gaze on the embracing statues were granted only to those who were pure in heart. It's immediately obvious that the cherubims changed. They were facing opposite each other if Israel wasn't righteous, and then they were joined together in this sexual embrace when Israel was being righteous. The idea is the only person who could have put the cherubim together was the high priest who entered the Holy of Holies. So this is one of his offices. This is one of his performances on the Day of Atonement. But we've forgotten that because the temple was destroyed. Such a marriage rite is described in the Zohar as well. Now on page 19, Sage says, the Tanhuma Numbers also recalls that the Holy of Holies was a nuptial couch, because just as the couch serves fruitfulness and multiplication, even so the sanctuary, since everything therein was fruitful and multiplied, the medieval Zohar Hadash also remembered the Holy of Holies as a wedding chamber for God and the exiled community of Israel. This is where Israel as a community was deified. This is what Leonora Leet, in her book on the Kabbalah, calls the secret doctrine of the divine son, turning all of Israel into the divine sons of God. This happened. The symbol for this is the sexually embraced cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat. This is what is being saved by grace meant to the ancient Israelites. Now the cherubim finally are paradigms of human marriage. It cannot have been mere coincidence that visitors to the festivals, when the loving statues were displayed, were said to have come to the temple in pairs, in other words, as married couples. They were intent on being instructed in the ways of the Lord. Thus we note that in Genesis 1:26 through 28, the creation of Adam and Eve by an Elohim, whose image was both male and female, this was immediately followed by the commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. In other words, to similarly bring the sexes together and beget children. This pattern is actually followed in Genesis 5, verse 3, where the exact same language which had been used to describe the creation is now used to describe the begetting of Seth. Adam begat Seth in his own likeness, after his own image. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. You see the similarity there. William Albright thus concluded that the latter passage contains an interesting case of demythologizing, where God speaks in the plural, referring to the gods of the heavenly council, the Sod, as they planned the creation of man. This, he added, was usually carried out in Near Eastern theogonies by the outpouring of semen, or created by sexual act. That is one of the biblical scholar archaeologists' conclusions. William F. Albright, one of the greatest on the planet in his day. Creation is through sexuality. That's not my conclusion. That is what the Bible scholars are saying. Thus, we are justified in viewing Genesis 1:26 as a direct model for the begetting of Seth. Then he says, Talmud and Torah scholars, this is on page 21, accordingly performed marital intercourse at precisely midnight on the Sabbath as a symbolic reference to the heavenly marriage. In this way, the Shekinah was made to rest between the deserving husband and his wife. The Kabbalah taught that the human couple must have a conscious intent to emulate the divine pattern. In this way, they themselves become cherubim, or a living chariot, a Merkava, for God's presence, just like the holy beasts in the temple. Then the Shekinah would dwell between the loving couple as it had done between the cherubim. It's fascinating how all the symbols coalesce together, and actual practical use with man and woman emulating God and his wife, and the symbol is the entwined cherubim in the temple, on the Ark of the Covenant, in the sacred bedchamber, the Holy of Holies, where the pilgrims went, and in the Holy of Holies were united to God in one. It was a spiritual fusion. This is the purpose of the temples. This is the background context for the deification of man and woman. It is an astonishing context. It's a context that's been lost. On page 22, it's been brought back, however, in Mormonism, just so you know. Indeed, so important was this heavenly pattern that it served as the model for God's own union with Israel itself, as well as for Christ's union with the church. Ephesians 5:31-32. Conversely, the heavenly union, which Paul would call a great mystery, in Ephesians 5:32, also applied to the marriage of men and women. This wasn't mere baptism, as a lot of Bible commentators thought. No, it is the marriage. It is the unification of God with man, done by the grace of God. We don't do it. God does. He gives us the pattern. At the same time, it is explained why Paul chose Adam at the time of his marriage, Genesis 2:24, as the figure of him who was to come, Romans 5:14, in other words, Christ. So he ties in the whole family, beginning with Adam and Eve's marriage, representing the heavenly marriage, all the way up to Christ, where Christ marries the church, and the individual pilgrims also see that symbol of the cherub, so that they are taught the heavenly pattern of how to unify the grand unification of God's own family, which we are a part of. Now that's breathtaking, isn't it? There's your context.